Kelly O'Donnell, very close by to the president this afternoon. Thank you, Kelly. I want to bring in MSNBC contributor and former FBI double agent Naveed Jamali. He's the author of How to Catch a Russian Spy. Also, Alan Smith, politics writer for Business Insider and Washington Examiner, White House correspondent Sarah Westwood, all three. We'll start with you here, Alan. You heard all of the statements, and we just, of course, were taking excerpts of the 5 different interviews that came from Jay Sekulow and his defense, spirited for the president, for Donald Trump Jr. as well. What's your takeaway here? Some of the defense that he's made is this parallel to Ukraine, right? And its supposed aid of Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first off, we've seen in recent days that the Trump defense team's defense of this meeting is that, look, collusion, what laws are broken? It's gone from no collusion happened to collusion is not illegal if this specific meeting took place, if what they're describing was what happened. And then the team's also trying to connect it to this Politico story from January about how a DNC operative met with members of the Ukrainian embassy to try to get information on Paul Manafort. And they're saying, look, the DNC did this very similar meeting. This actually had an effect on what happened to Paul Manafort later in the campaign when he was eventually ousted based on that Ukrainian ledger that came out. So they're making the argument that, look, the DNC did this. They're falling back again on the campaign, and they're really trying to sort of muddy the waters on necessarily what was wrong with this meeting with Donald Trump Jr.
Naveed, are those 2 examples the same?
No, I don't think they are. I mean, clearly there's an attempt here to put a moral equivalency here, which I don't think is going to pan out. But just taking a little bit of a turn here, let's focus for a second on what the Russian intent was. And I think that's an important part of this. It's clear to me as someone who's worked with the Russians that there was clearly a desire to try to make contact with the Trump circle, the Trump orbit. But there's also a second thing, the types of people that they're using. We've heard a lot of these weren't Russian officials. It's, they have perhaps ties to Russia. That is a textbook example of what we would call a cutout. And it goes back to the other part of a Russian intelligence operation. You have the mission objective, but you also want to make sure that there is non-attribution. So to me, this sounds like something that the Russians would do. And it also tells me, Richard, I think that the Russians were quite worried about being compromised and having attribution. Certainly you can see that in the fact that they used people not like Kislyak, but in fact people where the ties to Russia were perhaps questionable.
Softer touches, if you will, and connections.
Absolutely.
Sarah, as you look at the response here, and we heard there from Kelly O'Donnell, nothing official, but there are tweets that we get from the president time to time, and we got one today, and he said here, with all of its phony, unnamed sources and highly slanted and even fraudulent reporting, fake news is distorting democracy in our country. There again, alluding to the reporting that's coming out here, not seemingly that Jay Sekulow or any member of his team can keep the president from actually coming out with statements that at some point could hurt him.
Absolutely. I think that's probably why they sought to keep the president isolated from this information for as long as possible. They didn't bring him into the circle until just a few days before this news was set to break, even though the reporting suggests that his legal team was aware of this meeting weeks, if not months, before it emerged. Clearly, President Trump knows that he's kind of winning every time that he's hitting the media, at least to the eyes of his base. They love that. It's a political victory for him. It's easy. It's cost-free. And he can blame his troubles on the media. And in the eyes of his supporters, the information is coming from the media, and it continues to buoy him, this fight that he's having with the press, even though it's not really taking on the allegations themselves head-on. It's his way of coping, though, and it has helped him navigate previous controversies.
And there's been some movement in his legal team, he was intimating there. And Alan, with Ty Cobb now on board, and he hits the ground running with a new week starting tomorrow, or really today, but in terms of a work day, that's tomorrow. What's your thought in terms of what that might mean and signal and what he brings to the party here?
Well, look, I mean, it just signals that President Trump is increasingly taking this very seriously. This is another criminal defense attorney being added to the team. The team's getting beefed up. They clearly know that there's more coming here in the months.
He's the man, though, isn't it, in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's highly respected, known him as one of the top people in Washington and representing some of these issues.
Naveed, when you see who was in the room here with Trump Jr., and we've gone through the names before, and we understand that there are 6 that we are confirming here at NBC News. Put that all together. It has certainly been said that this is pretty typical of the steps by which have been used in other situations by the Russians. That this is part of the playbook.
That's absolutely right. I mean, what we would call it is a dangle. And in fact, while we don't know the other names of the people in the room, what would be a game changer is, in fact, if one of those people was, in fact, an official Russian government employee, official, or connected directly to the Russian government. So, but this is the standard, operating procedure for them, is that they were clearly trying to probe and see if they could get into the campaign and see if there was a friendly port. And, I think the person on the American side, on the U.S. side, that is perhaps in the biggest legal jeopardy, to sort of follow up with what Sarah was saying, is Jared Kushner. Because what you see here is, while this was a reactive action by the Trump campaign, that is to say the Russians came calling and they accepted the meeting, what you see 6 months later is very different, and that is Jared Kushner actually trying to set up meetings with, in fact, Kislyak. And I think that is perhaps a trend that we will be hearing a lot more about.
Yeah, and the New York Times, Sarah, and Akhmetshin very clearly laying out how this is not new stuff to him. He had gone through and he is very aware of the dynamics of how to conduct a meeting and keeping it covert if needed to be. Sarah, finally, these poll numbers, when we look at the counties that were essential to President Trump winning, and we look at what NBC News and the Wall Street Journal found, this whole topic of Russia and even healthcare not resonating.
Right, and that's something that Democrats have, some of them, started to realize and been wary of, diverting all of their energy into pushing these Russian allegations, because it doesn't necessarily resonate with some of the voters that Democrats will need to flip in 2018 and in future presidential elections. Where you see President Trump's numbers starting to fall, it's been a steady decline. It hasn't dropped sharply every time we've seen some kind of Russian-related controversy.
Yeah.
But the steady decline can be attributed to the stagnation of his agenda, and you can more or less draw a straight line between that stagnation and the Russian controversies, which are what's paralyzing his agenda. But folks are responding more to the fact that nothing is getting done than the fact that President Trump looks like his administration may have been misleading about the Russian allegations.
Yeah, well, and what we're seeing so far is somewhat bulletproof for the most part in terms of these counties that we polled. Sarah, Alan, Naveed, thank you all three. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Now, despite those polls showing historically low popularity